November 1st, 1964. Halloween night in America was coming to a close, but in South Vietnam, it was already the morning of November 1st, 2 o'clock in the morning. Most of the men at Bien Hoa Air Base were asleep in their quarters, exhausted from another day in what was still officially an advisory mission. The United States wasn't at war yet, not really. American forces in South Vietnam numbered around 23,000, but they were advisors, trainers, support personnel. They weren't supposed to be fighting a war. Tell that to the men at Bien Hoa Air Base. 15 miles northeast of Saigon, sitting on flat ground in a rural area that was rapidly becoming more dangerous by the day, Bien Hoa was the largest and most important air installation in all of South Vietnam. It had been built up considerably over the previous few years, as American involvement in Vietnam steadily increased. What started as a simple Vietnamese airfield had transformed into a major, joint operating base for both the South Vietnamese Air Force and the United States Air Force. The base sprawled across hundreds of acres. Concrete runways stretched into the distance, capable of handling the heaviest aircraft in the American inventory. Revetments lined the flight line, protective barriers designed to shield parked aircraft from shrapnel and blast damage. Maintenance hangars, fuel storage areas, ammunition dumps, operations buildings, living quarters for personnel. Everything needed to support a major air operation. And on this particular night, the flight line at Bien Hoa held an impressive and expensive collection of American air power. 20 B-57 Canberra jet bombers sat on the tarmac. These were tactical bombers, twin-engine jets capable of carrying a significant bomb load deep into enemy territory. They had arrived at Bien Hoa just 3 months earlier in August, part of a rapid buildup of American air power following the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The B-57s represented the first deployment of American jet combat aircraft to Vietnam, a significant escalation in American military presence even though, officially, the United States still maintained it was only providing advisory support. The B-57s weren't alone on the flight line. Several A-1EH Sky Raiders sat nearby, propeller-driven attack aircraft that were being used to train South Vietnamese pilots. These were rugged, reliable planes, capable of carrying enormous bomb loads and staying aloft for hours to provide close air support to troops on the ground. 3 HH-43 Husky helicopters were positioned near the operations area, ready to respond to any emergency. A couple of C-47 transport aircraft, the military version of the famous DC-3, completed the collection. It was millions of dollars worth of American aircraft, sitting in neat rows on an airfield that was supposed to be secure, protected by a perimeter of South Vietnamese irregular troops, watched over by Vietnamese and American security forces, theoretically safe from enemy attack. The men sleeping in the barracks that night had no reason to think otherwise. Sure, everyone knew the Viet Cong were out there somewhere in the darkness beyond the base perimeter. Everyone knew the enemy was getting bolder, more aggressive. But Bien Hoa was a major installation, well defended, close to Saigon, the kind of place that should have been safe. That assumption was about to be shattered in the most violent way possible. To understand what happened at Bien Hoa on November 1st, 1964, you have to understand how the United States got to that point. How American aircraft ended up parked on a Vietnamese airfield, how American personnel ended up sleeping in barracks 15 miles from Saigon, how the United States went from having a handful of military advisors in Vietnam to having thousands of troops and increasingly sophisticated equipment deployed to Southeast Asia. It was a gradual process, a slow escalation that happened almost imperceptibly over the course of years. American involvement in Vietnam began in the 1950s, when the United States started providing aid and advisors to the South Vietnamese government in its struggle against communist insurgents backed by North Vietnam. It was Cold War logic: contain communism. Don't let another country fall to the communists like China had in 1949, like North Korea had tried to do in the Korean War. Draw a line and hold it. Under President Eisenhower, American involvement was limited. A few hundred advisors, some military aid, diplomatic support for the South Vietnamese government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like a war. When President Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited this limited American commitment to South Vietnam, and over the next 3 years, he gradually expanded it. More advisors, more equipment, more money, more involvement in Vietnamese military operations. By the time Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, there were over 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam. But they still weren't officially at war. They were advisors. They were trainers. They were support personnel. They flew helicopters that transported Vietnamese troops into battle, but the Vietnamese troops were the ones doing the fighting. American pilots flew on combat missions, but officially they were instructing Vietnamese pilots. It was a carefully maintained fiction, a way of being involved in Vietnam without actually committing to a full-scale war. When Lyndon Johnson became president after Kennedy's assassination, he inherited this increasingly untenable situation. South Vietnam was losing. The Viet Cong insurgency was growing stronger every month. The South Vietnamese government was weak and unstable, prone to coups and political infighting. The South Vietnamese military, despite years of Americans training and billions of dollars in American equipment, was proving incapable of defeating the communist insurgency. Johnson faced a choice: either escalate American involvement to prevent South Vietnam from falling to the communists, or accept defeat and let South Vietnam go. For Johnson, raised on the lessons of Munich and the supposed failure of appeasement before World War II, trained in the Cold War logic of containment, accepting defeat wasn't an option. If South Vietnam fell, the reasoning went, then Laos would fall, then Cambodia, then Thailand. The domino theory: stop them here or fight them everywhere. But Johnson had a problem. It was an election year, 1964. Johnson was running for his first full term as president against Republican Barry Goldwater, a hardline conservative who was openly talking about escalating the war in Vietnam, about using tactical nuclear weapons if necessary, about taking the gloves off and fighting to win. Johnson couldn't afford to look weak on Vietnam, but he also couldn't afford to look like a warmonger. He needed to thread the needle to appear strong and decisive while also appearing measured and responsible. So, he made promises. He told the American people he wouldn't send American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. He portrayed himself as the peace candidate, the responsible leader who wouldn't drag America into another Asian war like Korea. And then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the USS Maddox, an American destroyer conducting intelligence operations in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. 2 days later, on August 4th, both the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported that they were under attack again in the darkness and bad weather of the Gulf of Tonkin. Whether that second attack actually happened remains controversial to this day. The evidence was murky. The sonar operators weren't certain. The weather was terrible. But Johnson seized on the incident. He went to Congress and asked for authorization to use military force to respond to aggression against American forces. Congress gave him what he wanted. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the House of Representatives unanimously, and the Senate with only 2 dissenting votes. It gave the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It was, for all practical purposes, a blank check to escalate American involvement in Vietnam however Johnson saw fit. But Johnson didn't want to escalate, not yet. Not before the election. He needed to appear restrained, measured, responsible. So he authorized limited retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam and left it at that. The real escalation would come later, after he'd won the election and no longer needed to worry about appearing too aggressive. In the meantime, though, the military buildup continued, more advisors arriving in South Vietnam, more equipment being shipped. And in August 1964, right after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a very visible escalation in American air power. 36 B-57 Canberra bombers from the 8th and 13th Bomb Squadrons were ordered to deploy from Clark Air Base in the Philippines to Bien Hoa Air Base in South Vietnam. It was the first deployment of American jet combat aircraft to Vietnam, a clear signal that the United States was prepared to use force, prepared to escalate if necessary. The deployment didn't go smoothly. As the B-57s approached Bien Hoa on the evening of August 5th, they ran into bad weather. Rain was pouring down, the runway was soaked. One B-57 crashed on approach. 2 more skidded on the wet runway and collided with each other, blocking the runway and forcing the rest of the flight to divert to Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon. Even the diversion didn't go well. One of the B-57s was hit by Viet Cong ground fire during approach to Tan Son Nhut and crashed, killing both crew members. Rescue parties couldn't reach the wreckage because of enemy fire. It was an inauspicious start. 4 aircraft lost before they even completed their deployment. Both crew members from one aircraft dead. And it highlighted a fundamental problem that would plague American operations in Vietnam for years to come. The enemy was everywhere. Even on approach to supposedly secure air bases near Saigon, American aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire. But despite the losses, the B-57s were now in Vietnam, some at Bien Hoa, some at Tan Son Nhut, ready to conduct combat operations if ordered. Officially, they were assigned to the 405th Fighter Wing at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. This was a technical fiction designed to get around the Geneva Accords, which prohibited the introduction of jet combat aircraft to Vietnam. If the B-57s were officially assigned to Clark and just temporarily deployed to Vietnam, well, that didn't count as introducing them to Vietnam, did it? Nobody was fooled. The B-57s were in Vietnam. They were going to stay in Vietnam. And everyone knew it. Over the next 3 months, from August to November 1964, the B-57 sat at Bien Hoa. They weren't being used for combat operations yet. That would require a direct order from the president, and Johnson wasn't ready to give that order. Not yet. Not before the election. So the aircraft sat on the flight line, ready but not active, a visible symbol of American air power, but not yet an active participant in the fighting. The crews maintained the aircraft, conducted training flights, waited. Some of them were frustrated. They'd deployed to a combat zone, and they weren't being allowed to fight. Others were relieved. They were pilots and navigators, not infantry. Sitting on an airbase in South Vietnam was a lot safer than flying combat missions over hostile territory. But sitting on that airbase, as it turned out, wasn't as safe as anyone thought. Halloween in America. Kids trick-or-treating, parties, costume contests. In Vietnam, where there was no Halloween tradition, it was just another night, just another rotation of guard duty, just another evening of maintenance work on the flight line, just another shift in the operations center monitoring the situation. For most of the men at Bien Hoa Air Base, October 31st rolled into November 1st without drama. Evening became night. Night became late night. The base settled into its nocturnal routine. Some men pulled guard duty, others slept. A few worked the night shift in operations or maintenance. Out beyond the perimeter, in the darkness of the Vietnamese countryside, something was moving. A Viet Cong mortar team, somewhere between 6 and 12 men, depending on which account you believe. They'd infiltrated through the outer defensive perimeter earlier in the evening, moving carefully. Through the darkness, avoiding the South Vietnamese irregular troops who were supposed to be patrolling the area around the base. It wasn't hard. The outer perimeter defense was provided by an irregular battalion that was 20% under strength and not particularly motivated. These weren't elite troops. They were local militia, poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly led. They were supposed to patrol aggressively within a 2-mile radius of the base, the maximum effective range of an 81mm mortar. But aggressive patrolling required discipline and leadership, both of which were in short supply. So, the Viet Cong mortar team moved through the darkness unmolested. They got within a quarter mile of the northern perimeter of Bien Hoa Air Base, close enough to see the lights of the base, to hear the sounds of generators and aircraft engines, to see the silhouettes of the B-57s sitting on the flight line. They set up their mortars. The sources disagree on how many. Some say 3 81mm mortars, others say 6. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that they had enough tubes and enough ammunition to do serious damage. They prepared their position, dug in the base plates, calculated the range to their targets, loaded the first rounds, waited for the signal to fire. Inside the base, most of the men were asleep. It was after midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, the graveyard shift, the hardest time to stay awake, the time when human beings are programmed to be sleeping, when alertness is at its lowest, when guards fight to keep their eyes open and their minds focused. Some of the men at Bien Hoa were dreaming about home, about wives and girlfriends, about families they'd left behind, about the lives they'd returned to when their tours were over. Some were dreaming about nothing at all, lost in the deep sleep of physical exhaustion. Some weren't dreaming, just unconscious. their bodies taking advantage of precious hours of rest. One of those men was Robert Guggenberger, an ordnance specialist with Navy Squadron VA-152. He'd been at Bien Hoa since April, training South Vietnamese pilots to fly A-1 Sky Raiders. He'd gone to bed on Halloween night like any other night, falling asleep in his bunk in the Navy area of the base, exhausted from another long day of work. He woke to what he first thought was thunder, but it wasn't thunder. Thunder doesn't come in regular intervals. Thunder doesn't shake buildings and shatter windows. Thunder doesn't make the ground jump beneath your feet. It was mortars, dozens of them, raining down on Bien Hoa Air Base in a carefully orchestrated barrage designed to do maximum damage to the aircraft sitting on the flight line. The attack began at 12:26 a.m., just 26 minutes after midnight, as October became November. The first mortar rounds fell on the northern edge of the base, near where the B-57 bombers were parked in neat rows on the flight line. Mortar. Attacks are particularly terrifying because of their nature. You don't hear the mortars being fired. There's no flash of light in the distance, no warning sound of incoming fire. A mortar round is fired almost silently from its tube, arcing up into the night sky, then falling back to Earth, accelerated by gravity. The only warning is the brief whistle of the round coming down. And by then, it's too late to do anything but pray it doesn't land on you. The first explosions rip through the night. Orange flashes lit up the darkness, the distinctive crump of high explosive detonations. Shrapnel screaming through the air, shredding metal and flesh with equal efficiency. On the flight line, the B-57 bombers were sitting ducks. They were parked close together to save space, which meant a single mortar round landing between two aircraft could damage both. The revetments that were supposed to protect them from blast damage weren't enough to stop a direct hit or a near miss. The first B-57 took a direct hit and exploded. Jet fuel ignited, sending flames shooting into the sky. The aircraft's ammunition and weapons cooked off in secondary explosions. Within seconds, what had been a multi-million-dollar jet bomber was a burning wreck. Then another B-57 was hit, and another. The mortar rounds kept falling, methodical and precise. The Viet Cong mortar team knew exactly where the aircraft were parked. They'd done their reconnaissance. They'd planned their attack carefully. And now they were executing that plan with brutal efficiency. Men were stumbling out of their barracks in various states of dress, some in uniforms, some in underwear, all of them shocked and confused. What was happening? Where was it coming from? What should they do? Training took over for some. They ran for their assigned positions, for bunkers and fighting positions, ready to repel a ground attack if one came. Others froze, paralyzed by shock and fear, unable to process what was happening. A few ran, toward the flight line, toward their aircraft, desperate to do something, anything, to save the planes they had spent months maintaining and preparing. Robert Guggenberger, the ordnance specialist, headed straight for the flight line, where the A-1 Sky Raiders were parked. He was in ordnance. Those were his planes, or at least the planes he worked on. If they were under attack, he needed to get there, needed to do something. He found chaos. The B-57s were taking the worst of it, but mortar rounds were falling all across the flight line, impacting randomly, sending shrapnel whistling through the air. 3 of the B-57s were already destroyed, burning fiercely, their fuel and ammunition cooking off in continuous explosions. Others were damaged, riddled with shrapnel holes, leaking fuel, their cockpits shattered. The A-1 Sky Raiders had been lucky so far. None of them had taken a direct hit. Guggenberger and the other Navy personnel would later describe feeling lucky that their aircraft had been spared while the Air Force B-57s burned. But people were down. American servicemen were lying on the tarmac, wounded by shrapnel, bleeding, crying out for help. 4 Americans would die in this attack. 2 South Vietnamese soldiers would also be killed. Dozens more would be wounded, some seriously. The mortar barrage continued. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The Viet Cong mortar team was in no hurry. They'd set up their position, they had their ammunition stockpiled, and they were working methodically through their fire plan. Hit the aircraft, hit the operations buildings, hit the living quarters, spread the damage around, create maximum chaos and destruction. American and South Vietnamese forces were trying to respond, but they were firing blind. Helicopters lifted off from the base, machine gunners spraying the darkness beyond the perimeter with .50 caliber machine gun fire. Tracers arced into the night, red streaks searching for targets they couldn't see. It looked impressive, thousands of rounds of ammunition being fired into suspected enemy positions. But they didn't hit anyone. Not one Viet Cong was killed during the attack. The mortar team was well concealed, dug in, prepared. The response fire was too late and too unfocused. And then, after 30 minutes of sustained bombardment, it stopped. The last mortar round fell. The explosions ceased. An eerie quiet descended on Bien Hoa Air Base, broken only by the crackling of flames, the groans of wounded men, the shouts of personnel trying to organize a response. The Viet Cong mortar team picked up their equipment and melted back into the darkness. They'd fired 83 mortar rounds in 30 minutes and then disappeared without a trace, vanishing into the Vietnamese countryside before American or South Vietnamese forces could close in on their position. They'd done their job. They'd struck a major blow against American air power. And they'd done it without losing a single man. Dawn broke over Bien Hoa Air Base on November 1st, 1964. The full extent of the damage became clear. 5 B-57 Canberra bombers were completely destroyed, burned out wrecks, still smoking, total losses that would have to be written off. 3 more A-1H Skyraider attack aircraft were also destroyed. 1 HH-43 Husky helicopter was a total loss. 2 C-47 transport aircraft were destroyed. That was the destroyed list. 9 aircraft completely written off, never to fly again. Millions of dollars in equipment reduced to scrap metal. But the damage didn't stop there. 13 more B-57s were damaged to varying degrees. Some had minor shrapnel damage that could be repaired relatively quickly. Others had major damage that would require extensive repairs before they could fly again. 3 more A-1H Skyraiders were damaged. 3 more HH-43 helicopters had taken shrapnel hits. In total, 27 aircraft had been hit. 9 destroyed, 18 damaged. It was the most successful Viet Cong attack on an American installation up to that point in the war. A devastating blow delivered in just 30 minutes by a small team of guerrillas armed with nothing more sophisticated than mortars. The human cost was equally stark. 4 Americans were dead. 2 South Vietnamese soldiers were also killed. 19 men were wounded, some seriously. One pilot, a South Vietnamese officer, had tried to take off in one of the A-1H Skyraiders during the attack. Maybe he thought he could get airborne and attack the mortar position. Maybe he was just trying to save the aircraft from destruction. Either way, it didn't work. The Skyraider crashed and burned during takeoff. The pilot survived, walking away from the wreckage, but the aircraft was a total loss. Later, personnel investigating the crash site found a large crater near the wreckage. Apparently, a 500-pound bomb had been set off by the fire, adding to the destruction. As the sun rose higher and the base began to fully assess what had happened, a disturbing fact became clear. The Viet Cong mortar team had been firing from inside the base perimeter. Or rather, they'd been firing from an area that should have been inside the base perimeter, an area that was supposed to be secured. They'd set up their mortars in or near the base's ammunition dump, a location that gave them excellent lines of sight to the aircraft parking areas, and also provided some concealment from observation. How had they gotten there? How had a Viet Cong mortar team penetrated the base perimeter, set up their mortars, fired 83 rounds over 30 minutes, and then escaped without being detected? The answer was uncomfortable but undeniable. The perimeter security had failed. The South Vietnamese irregular troops who were supposed to be patrolling aggressively had either not been patrolling at all or had been so ineffective that the Viet Cong simply walked past them. The American and South Vietnamese security forces on the base itself had no early warning, no indication of the impending attack, no chance to intercept the mortar team before they started firing. It was a failure at every level: intelligence failure, security failure, command failure, the kind of failure that gets people killed and equipment destroyed. And it exposed a fundamental vulnerability that would plague American forces throughout the Vietnam War. Air bases were huge targets. They required massive perimeters to defend properly. They had thousands of potential access points, and they relied on local forces for much of their security, forces that varied wildly in quality and commitment. Bien Hoa Air Base wasn't some isolated outpost in the middle of hostile territory. It was 15 miles from Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. It was supposed to be in a relatively secure area. If the Viet Cong could attack Bien Hoa with impunity, what did that say about American security anywhere in South Vietnam? The attack also demonstrated the lethality of mortars as an indirect fire weapon. Mortars are simple, they're portable. They can be set up quickly and taken down quickly. They don't require sophisticated fire control systems or extensive training. A reasonably competent mortar team can deliver accurate fire on target within minutes of setup, and they're devastating against aircraft on the ground. Aircraft are expensive, complex machines full of volatile fuel and explosive ordnance. They're designed to fly, not to withstand explosions. A single mortar round landing near an aircraft can cause catastrophic damage. Shrapnel tears through thin aluminum skin. Explosions rupture fuel tanks. Fire spreads rapidly. The attack on Bien Hoa proved that even a small enemy force armed with basic weapons could inflict serious damage on a major American installation. It was a lesson that would be relearned many times over the course of the Vietnam War, at bases all across South Vietnam. Mortars and rockets would become the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army's weapons of choice for attacking American installations, precisely because they were so effective and so hard to defend against. As American personnel at Bien Hoa spent November 1st cleaning up the damage, treating the wounded, and trying to figure out what had gone wrong, the question everyone was asking was simple. What happens now? How would the United States respond? News of the Bien Hoa attack reached Washington quickly. 4 Americans dead, dozens wounded, 9 aircraft destroyed, 18 damaged. A devastating attack on a major American installation. The kind of attack that demanded a response. The Joint Chiefs of Staff certainly thought so. They immediately recommended retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam. Hit them back, make them pay for attacking American forces. Show strength and resolve. This was exactly the kind of situation where conventional military thinking called for immediate and overwhelming retaliation. The enemy attacks you, you hit them back twice as hard. You make the cost of attacking American forces so high that they won't do it again. You demonstrate resolve and capability. But President Lyndon Johnson was in a very different situation. It was November 1st, 1964. The presidential election was 2 days away. 2 days. Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater on a platform that emphasized his restraint and responsibility, his commitment to not escalate the war in Vietnam, his promise not to send American boys to fight in Asia. And now, 2 days before the election, American forces had been attacked and Americans had been killed. The pressure to respond was enormous. The military wanted to retaliate. Republicans were going to hammer Johnson for weakness if he didn't respond. The press was going to ask tough questions about American security in Vietnam. But if Johnson authorized immediate retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam, 2 days before the election, he'd look like exactly the kind of warmonger he'd been accusing Goldwater of being. He'd be vindicating Goldwater's argument that the situation in Vietnam required a more aggressive military response. He'd be undermining his own campaign message about restraint and responsibility. Johnson made his decision: no immediate retaliation. Instead, he ordered the replacement of the lost aircraft. He convened his National Security Council to study the situation and develop options for responding. He made it clear he wanted those options, but he didn't want hasty action driven by emotion or political pressure. It was politically savvy, but militarily questionable. The message it sent to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong was that they could attack American forces and American installations without immediate consequences. The message it sent to American military leaders was that political considerations would sometimes trump military necessity, that the president would make decisions based on domestic politics rather than military logic. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor in Saigon was furious. He sent a cable to Washington arguing that the attack on Bien Hoa was a deliberate act of escalation, a change in the ground rules under which the Viet Cong had been operating. It should be met, Taylor argued, with an appropriate act of reprisal against a North Vietnamese target, preferably an airfield. Taylor's reasoning was sound from a military and diplomatic perspective. The Viet Cong had escalated. They'd attacked a major American installation, killed Americans, destroyed American aircraft. Not responding sent exactly the wrong message. It suggested weakness. It suggested the United States could be attacked with impunity. It invited further attacks. But Johnson had his own logic, driven by domestic political considerations that Taylor, sitting in Saigon, might not have fully appreciated. Johnson was 2 days away from what he hoped would be a landslide victory over Goldwater, 2 days away from securing a full term as president in his own right, free from the shadow of Kennedy's assassination, 2 days away from the political capital and legitimacy he needed to implement his Great Society domestic agenda. He couldn't risk that for a retaliatory airstrike. Not now, not yet. There would be time later, after the election, to deal with Vietnam properly. So Johnson waited. He let the military plan their options. He let Taylor send his cables arguing for retaliation. He made sympathetic noises to all the right people, but he didn't authorize immediate airstrikes against North Vietnam. Instead, on November 3, 1964, Americans went to the polls, and they gave Lyndon Johnson exactly what he wanted, a landslide victory. 61% of the popular vote, 44 states, 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. The biggest presidential victory margin since Franklin Roosevelt's landslide over Alf Landon in 1936. Johnson had won. He had his mandate. He had his legitimacy. And now, with the election behind him, he could turn his attention to Vietnam without worrying about domestic political blowback. On November 6th, 5 days after the Bien Hoa attack, the South Vietnamese Air Force launched a retaliatory strike. Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Thao Ky, who would later become Prime Minister of South Vietnam, led 32 aircraft in an attack against a Viet Cong base area. The South Vietnamese claimed to have killed 500 Viet Cong in the attack. Whether they actually killed 500 Viet Cong or whether that was propaganda inflation is impossible to verify. What matters is that somebody had finally retaliated for the Bien Hoa attack. Not the Americans, but their South Vietnamese allies. The United States had maintained its posture of restraint while still demonstrating that attacks on American installations would have consequences. It was a carefully calibrated response, designed to satisfy the need for some kind of retaliation without undermining Johnson's campaign message about not escalating the war. Whether it satisfied the military or made the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong think twice about attacking American forces is another question. The Bien Hoa attack on November 1st, 1964, established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the American involvement in Vietnam. The Viet Cong and later the North Vietnamese Army would conduct mortar and rocket attacks on American air bases and installations. Americans would scramble to respond, pouring fire into the darkness at targets they couldn't see. Casualties would be taken, equipment would be damaged or destroyed, and the enemy would disappear into the countryside before American forces could close with them. It was frustrating, demoralizing warfare. The enemy could strike at will, inflict damage, and then vanish. American firepower. Superiority didn't matter if you couldn't find the enemy to apply that firepower against them. American technological advantages didn't matter if the enemy could attack from darkness and concealment and then disappear before you could locate them. And it exposed the fundamental challenge of the Vietnam War. How do you defend everything, everywhere, all the time, against an enemy who can choose when and where to strike? How do you secure air bases that sprawl across hundreds of acres and require perimeters measured in miles? How do you prevent a small team of enemy soldiers from getting close enough to launch mortars or rockets? The answer, as it turned out, was that you couldn't. Not completely. You could make it harder. You could improve perimeter security, push out aggressive patrols, use sensors and detection equipment, establish listening posts and observation points. But you couldn't prevent every attack. The enemy was too mobile, too patient, too willing to take time and plan their operations carefully. After Bien Hoa, American commanders throughout South Vietnam took the mortar and rocket threat seriously. Perimeter defenses were strengthened, patrol patterns were adjusted, counter-battery fire procedures were developed. Devices that could detect incoming mortar fire and calculate the firing position were requested and eventually deployed, though they had limited effectiveness. But the attacks continued. In February 1965, just 3 months after the Bien Hoa attack, the Viet Cong struck again. This time, they hit Camp Holloway near Pleiku in the Central Highlands. 8 Americans were killed and over 100 wounded. helicopters and aircraft were destroyed or damaged. This time, Johnson authorized retaliatory airstrikes, Operation Flaming Dart, a series of bombing raids against North Vietnamese military targets. It was the beginning of sustained American bombing of North Vietnam that would eventually grow into Operations Rolling Thunder and Linebacker. The Pleiku attack was significant because it came at a different political moment than Bien Hoa. Johnson had won his election. He no longer needed to worry about appearing too aggressive before voters went to the polls. He'd spent the previous 3 months since the Bien Hoa attack studying his options, consulting with advisors, developing plans for how to respond to continued communist aggression in Vietnam. When Pleiku happened, he was ready to act, and his decision to authorize retaliatory bombing marked a clear escalation in American involvement in the war. No longer was the United States limiting itself to advisory and support roles. Now, American aircraft were actively bombing North Vietnam. Now the United States was directly engaged in offensive military operations against North Vietnam. In March 1965, just 4 months after Johnson won re-election on a promise not to send American boys to fight in Asia, the first American combat troops came ashore at Da Nang, 2 battalions of Marines, ostensibly to provide security for the air base there. But everyone knew what this meant. American ground combat troops were now in Vietnam, not advisors, not support personnel. Actual combat infantry, ready to fight. By the end of 1965, there were nearly 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. A year later, that number had grown to almost 400,000. At the peak of American involvement in 1968 and 69, over 500,000 American troops were deployed to Vietnam. It was a dramatic escalation, accomplished in just a few short years. And while there were many factors that contributed to this escalation, the Bien Hoa attack on November 1, 1964, was one of the key moments. It demonstrated that American forces and installations in Vietnam were vulnerable to enemy attack. It showed that the South Vietnamese security forces couldn't be relied upon to provide adequate protection. It proved that the Viet Cong were willing and able to strike at American targets directly. And it created political pressure for the United States to either escalate its involvement to protect its forces or withdraw and admit defeat. Johnson chose escalation, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, steadily, month by month. He increased American military involvement in Vietnam. More troops, more aircraft, more bombing, more combat operations. By the time he left office in January 1969, over 30,000 Americans had died in Vietnam, and the war had become the defining foreign policy disaster of his presidency. The Great Society programs he'd hoped to implement as his domestic legacy were overshadowed by Vietnam. His presidency was consumed by the war. Anti-war protests grew larger and more violent. Public support for the war eroded. In March 1968, facing potential defeat in the Democratic primary, Johnson announced that he wouldn't seek re-election. Vietnam destroyed Johnson's presidency, and the road to that destruction can be traced back, in part, to a 30-minute mortar attack on Bien Hoa Air Base on November 1, 1964. After the Bien Hoa attack, military analysts and security specialists studied what had happened and tried to develop lessons that could prevent similar attacks in the future. Some of those lessons were valid and were implemented. Others were learned but ignored due to practical constraints or political considerations. The most obvious lesson was that perimeter security needed to be dramatically improved. The fact that a Viet Cong mortar team could penetrate the outer defensive perimeter, set up their mortars within a quarter mile of the flight line, and conduct a sustained barrage without being detected was unacceptable. It represented a fundamental failure of security. The problem was that fixing it wasn't simple. An 81mm mortar has an effective range of about 2 miles. That means to prevent mortar attacks on an airbase, you need to secure an area extending 2 miles in every direction from the most important targets on that base. For a base the size of Bien Hoa, that meant securing an enormous area of Vietnamese countryside. Securing that area required troops, lots of troops, infantry patrols constantly moving through the area, checking for enemy activity, investigating suspicious activity, maintaining a visible presence that would deter enemy mortar teams from setting up. Static guard posts weren't enough. The enemy could observe guard post positions and simply set up their mortars between the guard posts, outside the guards' fields of observation. But troops were in short supply. American combat forces in 1964 numbered only in the thousands, and most of them were advisors or support personnel, not infantry available for patrol duty. The South Vietnamese military was responsible for perimeter, security around American installations, and as the Bien Hoa attack demonstrated, they weren't always up to the task. Even when more American combat troops arrived in 1965 and beyond, there were never enough troops to secure everything that needed securing. Commanders had to make difficult choices. Troops protecting air bases weren't available for offensive operations. Troops on patrol securing perimeters couldn't be used to pursue the enemy into their base areas. Every infantry battalion assigned to base security was a battalion that couldn't be used for search and destroy operations or pacification efforts. So, perimeter security improved after Bien Hoa, but it never became airtight. The attacks continued throughout the war. Major attacks on air bases and installations happened repeatedly. Da Nang was hit multiple times. Pleiku was attacked again and again. Tan Son Nhut, the air base right next to Saigon, was struck during the Tet Offensive in 1968. Every major American installation in South Vietnam experienced mortar or rocket attacks at one time or another. Another lesson from Bien Hoa was about counter-battery fire. When an enemy mortar team starts firing, you need to be able to locate their position quickly and return fire before they can pack up and leave. This requires specialized equipment and well-trained personnel. Counter-mortar radar systems were developed and deployed. These could detect incoming mortar rounds, calculate their trajectory, and determine where they'd been fired from. This information could then be used to direct artillery or airstrikes against the mortar position. In theory, this would allow friendly forces to suppress or destroy enemy mortar teams while they were still in position. In practice, it didn't work as well as hoped. By the time the counter-mortar radar detected the incoming rounds, calculated the firing position, and directed return fire to that location, the enemy mortar team was often already gone. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese mortar teams became adept at hit-and-run tactics. Fire a few rounds, displace immediately, be gone before return fire arrived. American forces also tried to use counter-battery patrols. These were small infantry units that would patrol likely enemy mortar positions, trying to intercept enemy teams before they could set up or catch them after they'd fired and were trying to withdraw. Sometimes this worked. Most of the time, the enemy avoided the patrols or simply waited until the patrols had moved to a different area. A third lesson from Bien Hoa was about aircraft dispersion and protection. The reason the Viet Cong mortar attack had been so effective was that the B-57s were parked close together in neat rows on the flight line. A few well-placed mortar rounds could damage multiple aircraft. After Bien Hoa, there was more emphasis on dispersing aircraft, parking them farther apart so that a single mortar round couldn't damage multiple. Planes. Revetments were improved and expanded, providing better protection from blast and shrapnel. Some aircraft were moved into hardened shelters when available, though there were never enough hardened shelters for all the aircraft that needed protection. But dispersion and protection measures had their own costs. Parking aircraft farther apart required more space and made maintenance and operations more difficult. Building revetments and hardened shelters required construction resources and time. And even with dispersion and protection, aircraft on the ground remained vulnerable to mortar and rocket fire. A fourth lesson, one that was learned but largely ignored, was about the vulnerability of concentrated American forces and installations in South Vietnam. By building large air bases and concentrating aircraft and personnel at those bases, the United States was creating high-value targets that the enemy could strike for maximum psychological and material impact. Some military thinkers argued that American forces should be more dispersed, operating from smaller installations that would be less vulnerable to attack and less attractive as targets. But the logistics of supporting air operations from multiple small bases were daunting. Aircraft required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance personnel, everything needed to keep them flying. Concentrating all of that at a few large bases made logistical sense, even if it created security challenges. So, the large air bases remained. Bien Hoa, Da Nang, Tan Son Nhut, Cam Ranh Bay, Pleiku, major installations with thousands of personnel, hundreds of aircraft, enormous fuel and ammunition stocks, tempting targets for the enemy, vulnerable despite the best security measures that could be implemented. Beyond the military lessons from the Bien Hoa attack, there were political lessons that would shape American involvement in Vietnam for years to come. The most important political lesson was about the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy. Johnson's decision not to authorize immediate retaliation for the Bien Hoa attack was driven entirely by domestic political considerations. He had an election in 2 days. He couldn't afford to look like a warmonger, so he delayed his response, prioritizing his electoral prospects over immediate military retaliation. This set a precedent that would plague American military operations in Vietnam throughout the war. Political considerations would frequently override military logic. Operations would be planned and executed with one eye on how they would play back home, how they would affect public opinion, how they would be portrayed in the media. This made military planning difficult and often compromised operational effectiveness. Commanders in the field wanted to pursue the enemy wherever they went, including into Cambodia and Laos, where the enemy had sanctuaries. But cross-border operations were politically sensitive and were often prohibited or severely restricted. The bombing of North Vietnam was carefully calibrated based on political considerations, with long lists of prohibited targets and rules of engagement designed to avoid provoking Chinese or Soviet intervention. Military commanders argued that these restrictions hampered their ability to effectively prosecute the war. Political leaders argued that the restrictions were necessary to prevent the war from escalating into a wider conflict with China or the Soviet Union. The Bien Hoa attack also demonstrated the challenge of fighting a limited war. The United States wasn't trying to conquer North Vietnam or overthrow its government. American war aims were limited: prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism, convince North Vietnam to stop supporting the insurgency in the South, create conditions for a stable South Vietnamese government that could defend itself. But the enemy wasn't fighting a limited war. For North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, this was an existential struggle. They were fighting for reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. They were willing to accept enormous casualties and endure years of hardship to achieve their goals. This mismatch in commitment and war aims created enormous challenges for the United States. How do you win a limited war against an enemy fighting an unlimited war? How do you convince an opponent to stop fighting when they view the conflict as existential? How do you achieve your political objectives without the level of military commitment that would be required to completely defeat the enemy? The Bien Hoa attack also highlighted the credibility problem that would haunt American policy in Vietnam. When Johnson didn't immediately retaliate for the attack, it sent a message to the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong that American threats weren't always followed by action. That American resolve could be questioned, that if they inflicted enough casualties and caused enough problems, the Americans might eventually give up and go home. This credibility problem would grow worse over the course of the war. Every time the United States imposed limitations on its military operations based on political considerations, it reinforced the enemy's belief that American resolve was limited. Every time anti-war protests grew larger in the United States, it convinced Hanoi that time was on their side, that they just needed to keep fighting, and eventually American public opinion would force a withdrawal. And the North Vietnamese were right. That's exactly what happened. By 1973, American combat forces had withdrawn from Vietnam, not because they'd been militarily defeated, but because domestic political pressure had made continued American involvement untenable. 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon and reunified Vietnam under communist rule. The Bien Hoa attack in November 1964 was just one small incident in this much larger story. But it was an important incident. It was a test of American resolve that the United States failed, at least in the short term. It demonstrated vulnerabilities in American security that would be exploited repeatedly throughout the war, and it came at a crucial political moment, just days before an election that would determine whether Johnson had the mandate to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. Johnson got his mandate, he won his election, and then he escalated. The path from the Bien Hoa attack to 500,000 American troops in Vietnam was not direct or inevitable, but it was discernible. Each incident, each attack, each demonstration of Viet Cong capability created pressure for escalation. and Johnson, step by step, gave in to that pressure. Behind all the strategic analysis and political calculations, there were real people at Bien Hoa on the night of November 1st, 1964. Men who woke to the sound of explosions, who ran toward danger to save their aircraft or their fellow servicemen, who were wounded or killed in the attack, who spent the rest of their lives remembering that night. Robert Guggenberger, the ordnance specialist with Navy Squadron VA-152, who we heard from earlier, survived the attack uninjured. He and his fellow Navy personnel were lucky. Their A-1 Sky Raiders weren't hit during the mortar barrage. But Guggenberger never forgot that night. The fear he felt, the confusion, the sight of the B-57s burning on the flight line. Years later, in online forums and veterans groups, Guggenberger would share his memories of that night. He emphasized that there had been no ground assault, that the damage was entirely from mortars, that the Viet Cong had fired from inside the base perimeter. He corrected inaccurate accounts that claimed the base had been in danger of being overrun, or that AC-47 spooky gunships had responded to the attack. Spooky gunships weren't even deployed to Vietnam yet. In November 1964, for Guggenberger and the other men at Bien Hoa that night, the attack was personal and immediate, not a strategic event to be analyzed, but a terrifying experience to be survived. The fear they felt wasn't about American policy in Southeast Asia, or the domino theory, or containment strategy. It was visceral, primal fear for their lives as high-explosive mortar rounds fell from the sky. The 4 Americans who died in the attack remain largely anonymous in the historical record. We know they were Army personnel. We know they died when mortar rounds struck their positions or living quarters. But their names, their stories, their lives before that night, most of that has been lost to history or remains buried in classified casualty reports. This is often the case with early casualties in a war. The men who die before the war becomes big news. Before the media is fully engaged, before casualty counts become national headlines, they fade into anonymity. Their deaths are recorded in official documents, their families receive telegrams and folded flags, but their stories don't become part of the larger narrative of the war. The same is true for the 2 South Vietnamese soldiers who died in the attack. Their names, if they were ever recorded by American forces, have been lost. They were likely members of the irregular battalion that was supposed to be securing the perimeter. They died doing a job they were probably poorly trained and poorly equipped for, defending an American installation in a war that would eventually cost millions of Vietnamese lives. The wounded from the attack faced a variety of fates. Some recovered fully and continued their tours in Vietnam. Others were evacuated to hospitals in Japan or the United States. Their wars ended by shrapnel wounds or blast injuries. Some carried physical scars for the rest of their lives. Others carried psychological scars, the kind of trauma that wasn't well understood or treated in 1964. The air crews who lost their aircraft in the attack had mixed feelings. On one hand, they were alive and unhurt. Their planes had been destroyed while they were sleeping in their barracks, not while they were flying them. On the other hand, their aircraft, the planes they'd trained on and maintained and prepared for combat operations, were smoking wrecks on the flight line. Some of them probably felt frustrated. They'd deployed to a combat zone, ready to fly combat missions, and their aircraft had been destroyed before they'd even been committed to action. They'd come to Vietnam to fight the enemy, and instead, the enemy had struck first, catching them unprepared, destroying their planes while they slept. Others probably felt relief. They were pilots and navigators, men who'd volunteered for flight duty because they wanted to fly, not because they wanted to be infantry. The destruction of their aircraft on the ground, as frustrating as it might have been, professionally meant they wouldn't be flying combat missions over North Vietnam, wouldn't be facing anti-aircraft fire and SAM missiles, wouldn't be risking their lives over hostile territory. For the maintenance personnel, the men who'd spent countless hours keeping those aircraft airworthy, the loss of the planes was personal. Each destroyed B-57 represented thousands of hours of work. Engines maintained, systems checked, repairs completed, pre-flight inspections conducted. And now that work was literally up in smoke, billions of dollars and countless man-hours reduced to charred wreckage. While most of the historical record of the Bien Hoa attack comes from American sources, it's worth considering the enemy's perspective. What did the Viet Cong hope to accomplish with this attack? How did they plan it? What did they learn from its success? For the Viet Cong, the Bien Hoa attack represented a significant escalation in their campaign against American forces in South Vietnam. Up until November 1964, most Viet Cong attacks on Americans had been small-scale ambushes or attacks on isolated positions. Going after a major air base was different. It was a direct challenge to American power, a statement that nowhere was truly safe, that even major installations close to Saigon were vulnerable. The planning for the attack would have required careful intelligence gathering. The mortar team needed to know where the aircraft were parked, where the important targets were located, how to get close to the base without being detected. This meant reconnaissance, probably conducted over weeks or months. Local Vietnamese who worked on the base or lived nearby might have provided information. Viet Cong agents might have infiltrated the South Vietnamese security forces. Observation from outside the base perimeter would have provided visual intelligence about aircraft locations and security patterns. Once the intelligence was gathered, the mortar team needed to plan their approach, their firing positions, their escape route. They needed to stockpile ammunition, probably storing it near their planned firing positions in advance. They needed to coordinate timing, ensuring they could set up their mortars, conduct their fire mission, and escape before American or South Vietnamese forces could respond effectively. The execution of the attack demonstrated that the planning had been thorough. The mortar fire was accurate and sustained. The team fired 83 rounds in 30 minutes, hitting 27 aircraft. That level of effectiveness required skilled mortar crews who knew their weapons and knew what they were doing. And the fact that the team escaped without losses suggests they had planned their withdrawal carefully. They knew where they were going, they knew how to get there, and they executed their escape under what must have been chaotic conditions, with American helicopters overhead and ground forces searching for them. From the Viet Cong's perspective, the Bien Hoa attack was a tremendous success. They'd destroyed 9 American aircraft and damaged 18 more. They'd killed 4 Americans and wounded dozens. They'd demonstrated that they could strike at the heart of American air power in South Vietnam. And they'd done it without losing a single fighter. The propaganda value was enormous. The attack showed that American forces weren't invulnerable, that for all their technology and firepower, they could be hurt by a small group of determined guerrillas armed with simple weapons. It was David versus Goliath, and in this case, David had landed some solid blows. The attack also served a strategic purpose by tying down American resources. After Bien Hoa, American commanders throughout South Vietnam would have to devote more troops and resources to base security. More patrols, more guards, more defensive measures. Every soldier assigned to guard duty was a soldier who couldn't be used for offensive operations. Every unit tied down protecting an airbase was a unit that wasn't available to search for and destroy Viet Cong forces. For the North Vietnamese leadership in Hanoi, the Bien Hoa attack was also valuable intelligence. It showed them what the Americans would and wouldn't do in response to attacks on their forces. Johnson's decision not to authorize immediate retaliation taught them that American responses would sometimes be delayed or measured, that political considerations would sometimes override military logic. This would influence North Vietnamese strategy throughout the war. They learned that they could absorb American military strikes and keep fighting. They learned that American domestic politics were a vulnerability that could be exploited. They learned that time was on their side, that if they could just keep fighting long enough, American public opinion would eventually turn against the war. The Bien Hoa attack was one small data point in that larger learning process, but it was an important one. It came at a crucial moment, right before the American presidential election, and it provided valuable information about how the Americans would respond under political pressure. The Bien Hoa attack received significant media coverage, though perhaps not as much as it would have received if it had happened at a different time. Coming just 2 days before the presidential election, it competed for attention with election coverage and analysis. American newspapers reported the attack on their front pages. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the major papers all ran stories about the mortar attack on Bien Hoa, the casualties, the damage to aircraft, the questions about security. The reporting was generally straightforward and factual. 4 Americans dead, dozens wounded, 9 aircraft destroyed. The stories quoted military spokesmen about the details of the attack and included Johnson's decision to replace the lost aircraft rather than authorize immediate retaliation. but the deeper implications of the attack weren't fully explored in the initial coverage. The press was focused on the election. They reported the Bien Hoa attack as news, but they didn't yet connect it to the larger story of American escalation in Vietnam because that escalation hadn't happened yet. In hindsight, the Bien Hoa attack can be seen as a harbinger of what was to come. It demonstrated the vulnerability of American forces in Vietnam. It showed that the Viet Cong could strike major installations with relative impunity. It highlighted the security challenges that would plague American operations throughout the war. But in November 1964, most of that was still in the future. The press reported the attack, noted the casualties, and then moved on to cover the election. Only later, as American involvement in Vietnam escalated and casualty figures climbed, would journalists look back at Bien Hoa as one of the early warning signs of the quagmire to come. The attack did reinforce certain narratives that were already developing in media coverage of Vietnam. The South Vietnamese forces were unreliable. The Viet Cong were more capable than they appeared. American forces in Vietnam were in a difficult and dangerous situation that was only getting worse. But in November 1964, these narratives were still developing. The American public wasn't yet deeply engaged with Vietnam. Most Americans probably couldn't have found Vietnam on a map. The war was something happening far away, involving relatively small numbers of American troops, not yet a major national crisis. That would change over the next few years as American involvement escalated. The nightly news would start featuring regular segments on Vietnam. Walter Cronkite and other trusted journalists would go to Vietnam to report firsthand. Casualty figures would become a regular part of news broadcasts. Anti-war protests would make headlines, but in November 1964, none of that had happened yet. The Bien Hoa attack was news, but it wasn't yet part of a larger narrative about American defeat in Vietnam. It was an incident, not a symbol, a tactical setback, not a strategic disaster. Only in retrospect, looking back from the perspective of the early 1970s after American withdrawal from Vietnam, would the Bien Hoa attack be seen as one of the early missteps on the road to defeat? One of the moments when things could have gone differently, when different decisions might have led to different outcomes. But history doesn't work that way. Decisions get made based on the information available at the time, the political pressures of the moment, the perceived options, and their likely consequences. Johnson made his decision not to retaliate immediately for Bien Hoa based on his political calculations in November 1964. Whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision is still debated by historians. What's not debatable is that the Bien Hoa attack happened, that it revealed vulnerabilities in American security in Vietnam, and that it contributed to the escalation of American involvement in the war over the following years. 60 years after the Bien Hoa attack, it's possible to see it in the context of the entire Vietnam War and American involvement in Southeast Asia. What seemed like a significant incident at the time becomes, in the long view of history, one small event in a much larger tragedy. Over 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. Millions of Vietnamese, both North and South, military and civilian, died in the conflict. The war cost hundreds of billions of dollars, destroyed Johnson's presidency, divided American society, and ultimately ended in communist victory and American withdrawal. Against that backdrop, the Bien Hoa attack seems almost insignificant. 4 American dead, 9 aircraft destroyed. It barely registers as a footnote in the larger story of the war. There would be much worse attacks, much higher casualties, much more dramatic events. And yet, the Bien Hoa attack matters because of what it represented and when it happened. It was an early demonstration of Viet Cong capabilities. It came at a crucial political moment. It influenced decisions about escalation. It established patterns that would repeat throughout the war. The attack also matters because of what it tells us about the nature of the Vietnam War and the challenges American forces faced. The enemy wasn't going to fight the kind of conventional war that American forces were trained and equipped for. They were going to use guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, mortars and rockets fired from concealment. American forces had overwhelming firepower superiority, better training, better equipment, better logistics. But none of that mattered if they couldn't find the enemy to fight. And finding an enemy who could strike from darkness and then disappear into the population or the jungle proved extraordinarily difficult. The Bien Hoa attack demonstrated this fundamental challenge early in the American involvement in Vietnam. It showed that even major installations close to the capital weren't truly secure. It proved that local security forces couldn't always be relied upon. It revealed that the enemy could plan and execute sophisticated operations despite American technological advantages. These lessons should have been learned from Bien Hoa. To some extent, they were. Security was improved, tactics were adjusted, resources were devoted to addressing the mortar and rocket threat. But the fundamental problem remained throughout the war. American forces in Vietnam were vulnerable to enemy attack, and there was only so much that could be done to prevent it. From a strategic perspective, the Bien Hoa attack also highlighted the challenge of fighting a limited war against an opponent fighting an unlimited war, the United States. He wasn't trying to conquer North Vietnam. American war aims were limited: prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism, convince North Vietnam to stop supporting the insurgency in the South. But North Vietnam's war aims were unlimited. They wanted to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. They were willing to accept enormous casualties and endure years of hardship to achieve that goal. And they correctly assessed that American commitment was limited, that American domestic politics would eventually force an American withdrawal. The Bien Hoa attack, in its way, was part of that strategy. Demonstrate that American forces are vulnerable, inflict casualties, tie down resources, undermine American public support for the war. It was asymmetric warfare, using small-scale attacks to achieve strategic effects. And it worked, not immediately. Not because of the Bien Hoa attack alone, but over time, the cumulative effect of thousands of small attacks, mounting casualties, endless news reports of American deaths, growing anti-war protests. All of it eroded American public support for the war. By 1968, a majority of Americans thought American involvement in Vietnam had been a mistake. By 1970, anti-war sentiment was so strong that it was politically impossible for any American president to continue prosecuting the war at the intensity of the mid-1960s. By 1973, American combat forces had withdrawn, leaving the South Vietnamese to fight on their own. And in April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Communist forces captured the presidential palace, and the Vietnam War ended in complete communist victory. Looking back from that endpoint, the Bien Hoa attack on November 1st, 1964, can be seen as one of the early steps on that long road to defeat. Not a decisive moment, not a turning point, but one incident among many that demonstrated the challenges American forces would face in Vietnam, the vulnerabilities that would be exploited, the pattern of attack and response that would characterize much of the war. Today, Bien Hoa Air Base still exists, now operated by the Vietnam People's Air Force. The old American installations have been modified or replaced. Vietnamese military aircraft sit where American B-57s once burned on the flight line. The base is part of a different country's military now, serving different purposes, operated by forces that once fought against the Americans who built it. There's no memorial at Bien Hoa to the 4 Americans who died in the mortar attack on November 1st, 1964. No plaque commemorating the event. The Vietnamese, understandably, don't memorialize American casualties in a war they see as a struggle for independence and reunification. In the United States, the men who died at Bien Hoa are remembered on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. Their names are there among the 58,000-plus names of all the Americans who died in the war. Visitors can look up their names, find their panels, make rubbings, leave tributes. But most people walking past those names don't know the stories behind them. They don't know that these 4 men died in the first major Viet Cong attack on an American air base, 2 days before a presidential election, in an incident that would help shape American escalation in Vietnam. The veterans who were at Bien Hoa that night remember. In online forums and veterans groups, they share their memories, correct inaccuracies, honor their fallen comrades. They remember the fear they felt, the confusion, the sight of aircraft burning, the sound of explosions. For them, the Bien Hoa attack isn't a historical event to be analyzed. It's a lived experience, something that happened to them, something they survived. The fear they felt that night didn't care about strategic implications or political calculations. It was immediate and visceral. Some of them probably wonder about the what-ifs. What if Johnson had authorized immediate retaliation? What if security had been better? What if the election had been a week later instead of 2 days later? What if American involvement in Vietnam had taken a different path? But history doesn't work on what-ifs. What happened, happened. The Bien Hoa attack occurred. 4 Americans died. 9 aircraft were destroyed. Johnson didn't immediately retaliate. He won his election. American involvement in Vietnam escalated. The war consumed his presidency. 58,000 Americans died. And in the end, North Vietnam won. The Bien Hoa attack was one small part of that story. An incident that mattered at the time, that influenced decisions, that revealed vulnerabilities. But in the sweep of history, it's just one moment in a much larger tragedy. What we can learn from Bien Hoa isn't about tactics or security measures or political calculations. What we can learn is about the nature of limited war, about the challenge of fighting an enemy who won't fight the kind of war you're prepared for, about the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy, about the difficulty of achieving political objectives through military means when the enemy is more committed and more patient. These are lessons that remain relevant long after the Vietnam War ended. American forces have faced similar challenges in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting enemies who use asymmetric tactics, struggling to achieve political objectives through military means, dealing with the constraints of domestic political pressure. The Bien Hoa attack, 60 years ago on November 1st, 1964, reminds us that these challenges are not new. American forces have faced them before. The specific circumstances change, the enemies are different, the technology evolves. But the fundamental challenges of asymmetric warfare, of fighting limited wars against determined opponents, of balancing military effectiveness with political constraints, those challenges remain. And so, we remember Bien Hoa, not just as a military incident or a historical footnote, but as a reminder of the cost of war, the vulnerability of even powerful forces, the unpredictability of conflict, and the importance of learning from history, even as we acknowledge that history doesn't repeat itself exactly. The 4 Americans who died that night deserve to be remembered. The men who survived and carried physical or psychological scars deserve to be honored. The aircraft that burned on the flight line represented not just material loss, but the labor of thousands of people who built them, maintained them, prepared them for operations. All of it matters. All of it deserves to be remembered. Not celebrated, not glorified, but remembered honestly as part of the larger story of American involvement in Vietnam. A story that includes heroism and sacrifice and also mistakes and failures and ultimately defeat. That's the lesson of Bien Hoa. Not a simple lesson about tactics or security, but a complex lesson about war itself, about the gap between intentions and outcomes, about the unpredictability of conflict, about the cost measured not just in dollars and equipment, but in human lives and human suffering. 60 years later, we remember. And in remembering, we honor those who served, acknowledge the complexity of what happened, and hopefully learn something about the nature of war that can help us make better decisions in the future. The B-57s that burned on the flight line at Bien Hoa on November 1st, 1964, are long gone. But their destruction echoes through history. One small incident in a much larger war, one moment that mattered and that deserves to be remembered.